This photo has the caption, "Japanese troops disarming captured British soldier, Malaya." And it was taken sometime between December 1941 and February 1942 when British Malaya fell to the Japanese during World War II. And I start with this photo because it conveys very well two key aspects of my paper. First, the core importance of looking at the interactions between British colonialism and Japanese imperialism in understanding how the developmental state project in Malaysia has taken the form of what I conceptualize in the paper as anti-colonial race capitalism. Second, I think the photo gives us a sense of this kind of male-centric discourse around geopolitical contestations between empires. And even when Global South actors are sometimes featured in the discourse, they tend to be more focused on male actors operating within male-dominated spaces like state, market, and politics. Let me give some context to those of you who may not be familiar with Malaysia. Race-based affirmative action emerged in tandem with the country's independence from the British in 1957, when the country was known as Malaya at the time. And given that this race-based agenda is a legacy of British colonialism, there is this popular but somewhat misleading narrative that the agenda has replicated the racial logic of British colonialism. Now, this agenda refers to a set of preferential treatment aimed at the majority group in the country known as the Bumiputra. And the Bumiputra itself is a gendered political category referring to groups deemed as native to Malaysia. And the Malays forms the dominant subgroup within the Bumiputra category. The Bumiputra agenda started rather modestly in 1957, but under what is known as the New Economic Policy in 1971, the agenda has since been significantly expanded, particularly in this goal of wanting to create a Bumiputra capitalist class as a central piece of the post-colonial developmental state project. Within this context, I felt the need to articulate the kind of racial logics which are at work in non-white, non-Western contexts, and more specifically in recovering the role of Japanese imperialism and not just British colonialism to unpack the racial logic of the Bumiputra agenda. I'm also interested in how this racial logic is being reproduced, which has sustained the developmental state in Malaysia as a form of race capitalist project. And it is here that I think Cynthia Enlow's question, "Where are the women?" is pertinent as a provocation to interrogate more closely the less obvious and gendered spaces of capitalist reproduction. Now, this is the outline of the paper where after introduction, the next section provides an explanation of why I have conceptualized the Bumiputra agenda as anti-colonial race capitalism, and I situate this discussion within broader debates on race, capitalism, and colonialism. Then the next three sections basically set out the arguments of the paper, starting with gendering the British suppression of Malay capitalism, then reclaiming the Japanese imperial origins of Bumiputra capitalism, and finally, before conclusion, just thinking through some contradictions under this anti-colonial race capitalist project. So just to briefly summarize the arguments of the paper, at the heart of this is really how the colonial suppression of Malay capitalism involved not just the organization of production, but also social reproduction, seen in the preservation of Malay peasant household structure and gender relations. And this has actually been a very conscious policy of the British colonial administration. The Japanese occupation subsequently inspired Malay nationalists with a new developmental model and racial logic, something Malay nationalists had adapted to shape the post-colonial developmental state to be a race capitalist project to invert the racial logic of British colonialism. And this entailed the disintegration of the Malay peasant household structure and also the reconfiguration of gender roles and relations. So while this anti-colonial project did confront the colonial suppression of Malay and Bumiputra capitalism, its capitalist underpinnings have also created a gendered class of exploitable Malay women and engendered new forms of racial and gender oppression. So in closing, I suggest that my paper has helped to recenter race and colonialism in thinking about the developmental state, not just to see it as a raceless, planned, rational economy striving for growth and industrialization, but as something shaped by the contested logics of empires in the global economy. But in theorizing this as anti-colonial race capitalism, I also don't approach these global geopolitical contestations between big powers as deterministic, but I emphasize the agency of global South actors in appropriating the logics of empires and adapting them into a national capitalist project. And finally, my paper calls for more gendered understandings of race capitalism, foregrounding social reproduction in the household, as well as the gendered lives of non-elites as key sites to interrogate the politics of anti-colonialism.